And you're starting us out, correct?
Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the July 28th WARUC Steering Committee meeting. My name is Era Swanson. I'm with Enviro Issues and part of the consultant team on the WARUC Forward Drive project. Before I hand it over to Roy to officially get us started, just wanted to cover our usual Zoom reminders for a meeting so we can take a look at the next slide. So I know many of us are very well practiced, more than we want in Zoom at this point, but just a couple reminders. When you're not speaking, please do keep yourselves on mute. That'll just help everyone be able to hear our speakers and those participating in the discussion. As we'll probably have a lot of folks joining us via video, it also does help the Zoom bandwidth. If you keep your video off, that's totally optional for you, but just a reminder for that. And then if you need to, you can also update your Zoom name. If you click on participants on the bottom, you'll get a little box there that says more, and that allows you to change your name if you need to. And then when we get to the discussion and the Q&A portion for our steering committee members, we just ask that you raise your hand using that button either in the participants box or at the bottom. You should also have a hand there. So raise your hand and then our chair Jennings will call on you. You can pop off mute and video and ask your question or add your comment. With that, I'll turn it over to Roy to get us started.
Thank you. So first, I want to welcome everybody to the Road Usage Charge RUC Steering Committee meeting. Today is July 28, 2021, and we really have a lot of information to cover today. But before we start, I need to let you know that this meeting is being recorded, and it will be posted to the webpage after this meeting. I also would like to personally welcome Jane Wall to the Steering Committee. Jane is the Executive Director of CRAB. She is replacing John Coaster, if I said that right, who was representing counties on the steering committee. Jane, would you like to introduce yourself and say a few words?
I don't believe Jane has joined us yet today.
Well, then we won't introduce her. Forget all that. Okay, with that, why don't we have the roll call? Era?
Okay, sounds great. And I know we don't have everyone yet today, but I will call folks' names just in case I miss somebody as we go. As I call your name, if you wouldn't mind just hopping off mute and just saying here, present, just letting us know you're here, that would be great. All right, Chair Roy Jennings.
Roy is Washington State Transportation Commission, and here.
All right, Commissioner Hester Cerebrin. I don't believe she's here today. Commissioner Kelly Fukai.
Good morning, everyone. I'm here.
Right. Representative Jake Fye.
I am present.
Senator Steve Hobbs. Don't believe he's with us today. Senator Curtis King.
I am here.
Representative Andrew Barkus. Representative Ed Orcutt.
I am here.
Senator Rebecca Saldana. Senator Phil Fortunato. Representative Bill Ramos.
Ramos is here.
Representative Judy Cliburn.
I am here.
Jason Richter. Debbie Driver.
I am here. Sorry, I couldn't find mute.
No worries. Welcome. Justin Layton. Kurt Augustine,
I'm here.
David Burnett, Chris Herman,
Present. Good morning.
Tom Hinkson, I believe let us know he could not make it today. Josh Brown,
Present. Good morning, everybody.
Bo Perschbacher,
Yep, I'm here.
Jane Wall. Don't believe she's joined us yet. Mayor Mary Lou Pauley. Sharon Nelson.
Here.
Janet Ray, I believe she could not make it today. Tom Walrath. Neil Streggy. Ted Trepanere.
Good morning. I'm here.
Doug Vaughn.
Yes, good morning.
Bryce Yaden.
Here.
And Brian Ziegler.
Good morning. Last but not least, but present.
Wonderful. All right, before I turn it back to Roy, are there any other steering committee members that I missed that may have joined us while we were calling the roll? Okay, I think we got everybody. All right, Chair Jennings, it's back to you.
Okay, so I would now ask everyone to go ahead and mute their microphones and turn off their cameras during the presentations. If you have a question, please turn on your camera, and as she said, use the raise hand function. You will be called in the order that we see you. It will help us if you turn them all off now and then turn them back on when you have a question. In addition, you can type your questions in the chat box, and the presenters will try to answer them as they see them. If not, we'll go ahead and make sure that at the end during Q&A, we will get those questions asked. Now we'll get a recap of the 2021 legislative session from Rima Griffith, the Executive Director, Washington State Transportation Commission. Rima?
Thanks, Roy. Let's see, I think we have a slide we can show while I talk real quick. Most of you were kept up to speed during session, so this will be pretty short. But as you know, I think there's one more slide after this. The Senate, Senator Saldana did introduce legislation, substitute Senate Bill 5444 was introduced. This slide just gives a very high level summary of the bill that made its way to the second reading calendar on the Senate floor and now currently resides in the Rules Committee for potential potential action, I suppose, in the 22 section. Could go back to committee as well. But the bill did really carry forward a number of the recommendations that emerged in the report that was submitted to the legislature in 2020. The highlights: by July 1 of 25, a volunteer early adoption RUC program would have begun, which allowed EVs and plug-in hybrids to opt in early to avoid the $225 flat fee they're currently paying. And then on July 26th, the flat fee of $225 would be repealed and replaced with the RUC program at an introductory rate of 2 cents per mile. So all EVs and plug-in hybrids at that point in 26 would move over. The revenues generated from this program would be deposited into the motor vehicle fund to pay for roadway preservation and maintenance specifically. And then it had quite lengthy language providing privacy and data protections and exempting RUC data from public disclosure. The chart below just kind of plots that timeline there. The bill also did direct the Commission and the Department of Licensing to work on a detailed implementation plan that would come back to the legislature in 2023, or the 24 session consideration. So that bill did, like I said, make it to the second reading. There was also a great work session that we had in the House Transportation Committee during session. And had a great discussion there with lots of questions. On the Senate side, when the bill was heard, I want to thank some of you who joined us in testifying, including Sharon Nelson and Mayor Pauly, who delivered some great testimony. And it was a great discussion and hearing in the Senate really as well. And I guess the progress we've made is that we didn't really, other than a couple of folks, the testimony wasn't about stopping RUC. It was more about how RUC would advance, under what terms, who would pay and how much, of course, all the details. But the discussion seemed to have shifted in large part to what it would be and how it would take shape in our state. I think that was promising if we want to find a high point, but we realize there's still a lot of progress to make as we continue to try to keep this discussion going in the legislature. I don't know if any of the legislators would also like to offer comments or not. I see Representative Workett has a question. So we'll start with you, and then if Senator King or any of the other legislators want to chime in and offer their thoughts on session, that'd be great.
So this is a sticking point with me and always has been when we talk about the electric vehicle fee, especially since 2042 was passed a couple of years ago. The draft report you have shows replacing the $225 fee with the RUC, and Senate Bill 5444 does the same thing, but not all of the $225 was in lieu of gas tax. Some of that was for EV charging stations, and some of that also went to paying back the tax exemption. So Remo, when we do reports like this, can we kind of compare apples to apples and talk about what is the actual amount that's going to the road fund as a result of the fee?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's like $75 or $100 that actually goes towards roads. That's actually in lieu of gas tax, and the rest of this is vehicle EV charging and the EV tax incentive payback.
Absolutely. And that, I mean, yeah, that is absolutely true and is worth noting. I think the reason we haven't really dwelled on that allocation of the current fee is because, of course, it's up to the legislature to decide how it wants to treat any road usage charge revenues that come in. But it's fair to say RUC on these vehicles, replacing that flat fee doesn't imply that that distribution is going to remain the same. And in the case of the Senate bill, it was not. It had all the funds going to preservation and maintenance. Any other legislators want to offer any comments, thoughts? Okay. Well, Mr. Chair, I'll hand it back to you then.
So now I'll ask Travis to walk us through the project update.
Thank you, Chair Jennings, and good morning, everyone. It's nice to be back with you all again. Looking forward to the next one together in December. I'm going to briefly introduce the project update, which is the majority of our agenda for today. We have 3 presentations on the 3 topics that many of you attended spotlight sessions on earlier in the spring and had deep dive discussions about the topics of our equity, outreach, and financial analysis, the RUC innovation research, and cost reduction effort through a series of workshops. So you're going to hear an update on all 3 of those today at a slightly higher level than you heard if you attended the deep dive spotlights in the spring. And then at the end of today's steering committee meeting, we'd like to present some initial thoughts on where we think we're heading with regard to pilot testing for 2022, because over the course of the rest of this year, including another round of spotlight sessions in the fall and our last meeting of the year in December, what we'd like to accomplish by the end of the year is really narrowing in on what are the features that we would like to test in the next round of testing under the Forward Drive project in 2022. So we'll get a preview of that today, because I'd like to make sure that all of you are thinking about what your preferences and priorities are so that we can capture that in our down select of pilot test ideas. So if you want to advance to the next slide, please, Annalise, a few thought questions that kind of hang over the meeting today. So as you're hearing these presentations, it'd be great if you could be thinking in the back of your minds about what are the policy challenges facing RUC, and how can the new technologies and new approaches that you're hearing about help address some of those policy challenges. Likewise, what trends are you aware of, either through the presentations today or through your other work in the automotive sector or consumer sector, or other trends that you believe could be useful to incorporate into our research on developing a RUC system. And likewise, what innovations and best practices are relevant and interesting and worthwhile to test. And then just as a catch-all, what other ideas do you have beyond what you're hearing from us about what might be interesting to test in a small scale pilot? So with those as sort of framing questions for the presentations today, we're going to start with the equity research. I'm gonna hand it first over to Allegra Calder from Burke and her team. And then also after that to Henry Yates and Linda from Yates Consulting to give us an update on the equity outreach and financial analysis research. So next slide, please, Annalise, and Allegra, please take it away.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Allegra Calder with Burke Consulting, and I'm going to kick us off with just a few slides before handing it over to Chloe Kinsey and Jay Shee, also at Burke, who did the bulk of the analysis we'll present to you today. REMA sent out the paper that is sort of the basis for this. We've had a review process, but if you have questions or comments that raises, feel free to get back to REMA. You can just reply to her email by the end of August. And we can follow up if there are specific questions related to the paper, and any comments, we'll take those into consideration. So if we can move to the next slide. This is what the sort of charge from the proviso for both this work and the work that Henry and Linda will speak to you about. At the beginning of the project, we met with several of the legislators on this call to just better understand sort of the intent behind it and the sort of specific populations that are mentioned here. And so we've used that as we've moved forward. If we can go to the next slide. So what's important about the financial analysis that we're going to present here is that it's actually a pretty specific question. And we want to sort of frame that within, there's a broader conversation right now going on about transportation equity, and I would say just sort of inequities across our society in general. But our question for this research was, would households in different income brackets pay more or less under a potential road usage charge compared with the gas tax? So we'll talk in a minute about what assumptions we used to do that analysis. If we can go to the next slide, just to sort of put it in the context of some of the broader transportation questions, because I think some of this does come up in testimony related to RUC and just other conversations that are being had in the legislature and elsewhere. There are these questions around, well, what funding, what percent of transportation funding is paid by whom, and where and on what do we invest those transportation revenues? And so those are all questions that I think are important to keep discussing. They are not the questions that we are examining in this analysis. So while I think it's important to frame it within the broader context, again, just a reminder as we go through this that this is a very specific type of analysis we're doing. So next slide, please. So in terms of definitions, if we can move to the first one, we've had a lot of conversation at the steering committee around the various definitions of equity. I think in our earlier work, we talked about the fact that a road usage charge starts to achieve what's known as horizontal equity, in that everybody pays the same amount. So it does do that. It does not consider ability to pay, which is what we would consider vertical equity. We've also talked a fair amount, our survey respondents in the first pilot actually mentioned vehicle weight a lot, so that has come up. We have done, Mark Madison and others have looked at the impact of sort of urban versus rural with respect to a RUC. Linda and Henry will talk to you a little bit about how they are addressing the sort of systems and operational equity pieces and the process equity piece. And increasingly, we are talking about cross-generational equity, and that's just making sure that we are considering any policy choices that we make today and what those long-term effects might be, particularly related to climate change, which feels very relevant right now. So let me now hand it over to Chloe to talk through some of the assumptions before we move to the findings.
Thanks, Allegra. So a brief review of some of the assumptions and data underlying our analysis. First, we assumed a RUC rate of 2.4 cents per mile, which is equivalent to what a driver of an average fuel efficiency light duty vehicle currently pays in gas tax on a per mile basis. We also assumed that vehicle owners paying a RUC would no longer pay the gas tax. The data that we used for this analysis come from several different Federal Highway Administration sources and from the American Community Survey for the income and demographic information. Next slide, please. Because our analysis is focused on the impact of implementing a RUC on households in different income brackets, we first considered the question, who is low income in Washington state? And there's no single definition of low income for Washington state. Different agencies and programs use different thresholds, including ones based on the federal poverty guidelines, HUD's subsidized housing income limits, and other measures. And some of these measures consider household size, some consider geography, and some consider both. Next slide, please. The table you see here shows the threshold for a household to be classified as low income under a variety of these different measures by household size. And as you can see, it really varies based on the measure what the threshold is. For small households of 1 to 2 people, the thresholds move up to and approach around $60,000 per year. And then for larger households, they are then higher than that. Next slide, please. And I will now pass it over to Jay Shi for the next part of the analysis.
Thanks, Chloe. So now that we explored the context of who is low income in Washington state, we turn to our main research question of whether households in different income brackets pay more or less under a gas tax versus a road usage charge. We could go to the next slide. So the chart you're seeing on this slide shows estimated costs on average to Washington respondent households in the National Household Travel Survey under a estimated road usage charge shown in the teal bars and under estimated gas tax shown in the dark blue bars. As you may observe, when moving from low income households to higher income households, we're really not observing a clear trend on whether they pay more or less under a gas tax versus a road usage charge. And in fact, we found that there is no statistically significant difference in the cost paid under a gas tax versus a road usage charge within any income group. Over the next couple slides, we'll be detailing a subset of research questions that form the basis of the findings that you're seeing on this slide here to provide you with more context. And we'll be revisiting these findings at the end of the presentation to explore more why you're seeing what you're seeing and what it means. If we could go to the next slide. Yep. So when considering the cost to a road usage charge versus a gas tax, there's two primary factors to really consider, which are vehicle fuel efficiency and vehicle miles traveled. We'll explore both, and we'll start with vehicle fuel efficiency. So the first question we wanted to look at is, what is the relationship between fuel efficiency and vehicle type and age? The chart you're seeing on this slide shows average vehicle fuel efficiency by vehicle model year for a variety of different vehicle types. And you'll note that cars are the most fuel efficient vehicle type, while SUVs and pickup trucks in particular are some of the less fuel efficient vehicle types. You'll also note that older vehicles tend to be less fuel efficient than newer vehicles among all vehicle types. If we could go to the next slide. We also wanted to explore what is the makeup of Washington vehicles by vehicle type. The chart you're seeing here shows total vehicle registrations by vehicle type for Washington vehicles from 2014 to 2019. As of 2019, cars are still the most prevalent vehicle type in Washington state. They make up about 40% of Washington vehicles. But the vehicle type showing the largest growth over this time period is SUVs. They've grown by about 44%, while cars have only grown by about 7%, and pickups and vans have grown by about 11%. If we could go to the next slide. We also wanted to look at how does vehicle type ownership vary by household income. And we found that lower income Washington respondent households own a higher proportion of cars and pickup trucks and a lower proportion of SUVs relative to higher income households. And that's interesting to note as we covered how fuel efficiency varies by vehicle type. And And we'll explore that a little bit further in the presentation. If we go to the next slide, we also wanted to look at how vehicle age varies by household income. And we found that on average, lower income Washington respondent households tend to drive older vehicles than higher income Washington respondent households. And that follows a pretty clear trend, as you can see on the chart on this slide. And if we could go to the next slide. So now that we've considered the questions on the two previous slides on how does vehicle age and vehicle type vary by household income, we wanted to look at how does vehicle fuel efficiency vary by household income. And we actually found that there is no clear discernible trend in the relationship between vehicle fuel efficiency and household income. And we think that's due to a variety of different factors. One of the primary ones we wanted to note here is that as we observed, lower income households tend to own a higher proportion of cars, which are the most fuel efficient vehicle type, but they also tend to own older vehicles. The inverse is true of higher income households. They tend to own a higher proportion of SUVs, but also a higher proportion of newer vehicles as well. And so we think those kind of factors are sort of contributing to why you're seeing the findings that you're seeing on this slide. I'll also note that in terms of average fuel efficiency, across the income thresholds, we're really talking about a pretty narrow band. We're talking about differences of 1 to 2 mpg between the lowest income bracket and the highest income bracket. And that's important to consider and keep in mind as we think back on our finding that there is no clear trend of households paying more or less under a road usage charge than a gas tax in different income levels. Next, we'll consider the other primary factor when considering costs under a road usage charge and a gas tax, which is vehicle miles traveled.
Yeah, so this question of vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, has significant implications for a potential RUC, because under a RUC, VMT is the sole variable factor that determines a household's RUC burden. Next slide, please. So we looked at miles driven by Washington state households in comparison to US households, and then by income level. Washington households are driving fewer miles on average over the course of a year than US drivers are. We also found that higher income households in Washington state and in the US tend to drive more miles over the course of a year than do lower income households. And part of what is driving that is that lower income households own fewer vehicles on a per household basis than do higher income households. Next slide, please. So as Jay mentioned, these findings around income, fuel efficiency, VMT all converge when we look at the estimated average annual costs under RUC versus gas tax by income group. As Jay said, the difference between the estimated average annual cost under RUC versus the gas tax is not statistically significant for any of these income groups. You can see there are slight variations, slight differences in the average costs across the income groups, but none of those are large enough to rise to the level of being statistically significant. That finding was really interesting to us because we know that annual RUC costs are determined by how many miles a household drives, and gas tax costs are determined by two variable factors: how many miles a household drives over the course of a year, and the vehicle fuel efficiency of their cars or of their vehicles. So a finding of no difference in cost between RUC and the gas tax implies that in the status quo, fuel efficiency is having little impact on those total annual costs paid in gas tax. And because of that, we tested that question using a regression analysis, and what we found was that was in fact the case. Under the status quo, VMT, the number of miles that a household is driving per year, actually has a 30 times greater influence on annual gas tax costs than does vehicle fuel efficiency. And the reason for that is because the number of miles that Washington state households are driving over the course of the year varies really widely. Some households are driving hardly at all, and some households are driving tens of thousands of miles per year. But most households, as Jay mentioned, still fall within a relatively narrow range of MPG values for their vehicle fuel efficiency. The one caveat to this is that this analysis is based on 2017 data, which is the most recent available. And we know that the percentage of hybrid and electric vehicles on the road is already greater now than it was in 2017, and it's only expected to grow in the future. So as that proportion of electric and hybrid vehicles grows, the variation in vehicle fuel efficiency across households will increase, and fuel efficiency will have a greater impact on those annual sum gas tax costs than it does currently. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so as noted earlier by Allegra, this equity analysis that we've conducted is just one piece of a larger discussion around transportation equity. And to place our findings into further context, we found it important to explore the question of how much household income is spent on transportation costs and how much is spent on the gas tax in particular. So if we go to the next slide, a question we wanted to look at is what percentage of household income is spent on transportation costs. As you may observe, there is a clear trend in lower income households spending a higher proportion of their income on transportation costs than higher income households. Households making less than $30,000 a year, for transportation costs represent about 40% of their household annual income on average. Whereas for households making greater than $150,000 a year, transportation costs represent about 9% of their household annual income on average. When we turn to, if we go to the next slide, when we turn to gas taxes in particular, this same relationship holds with lower income households spending a higher proportion of their income on gas taxes than higher income households. For households making less than $30,000 a year, gas taxes represent about 1.4% of their household income on average, while gas taxes only represent about 0.2% for households making $150,000 a year or more. And we just closed our presentation on that note because while our analysis focuses quite narrowly on whether households pay more or less under a gas tax versus a road usage charge, we circle back to the point we made earlier in the presentation that there is room for more research on the impacts of transportation costs or the gas tax or road usage charge in particular on households at different income levels or other characteristics, as well as other broader equity questions such as how much transportation funding is paid for by who and for what investments. On that note, we close our portion of the presentation and welcome any questions that you might have.
Senator King, it looks like your hand is up, and then Sharon Nelson. Go ahead, Senator King.
Thank you very much. So I'm curious, as you've done this analysis and the 2.4 cents per mile is equivalent to the same as the gas tax, something of that nature. Did you factor in the fact that if we wanted to raise, if the legislature wanted to raise the same amount of money that we generate off of gas tax, that it's going to cost us probably, rather than being a half a cent, it's going to cost us 10 to 12% to collect it, and factor that in any way?
Our analysis, there is some discussion of that in the cost section. We were looking at the cost to the individual. So our analysis was not focused on the cost of collection. But point taken, and there is a separate track that's looking at administrative costs.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sharon?
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking one of the reasons that we're doing these analyses now is the legislature wants to know how very unpopular this might be. And I was thinking that early on we heard that the auto insurance industry was taking this up as a way to price their products. And so I was just wondering if we're keeping an eye on how, that's a market phenomenon, and just how many Americans are taking the auto insurance industry up on that pricing option. Because I think that's the other thing about this is that the gas tax was just so uniformly applied, so easily collected. These analyses require a lot more individual choice. What kind of car do I own? Where do I live? So I think it would be interesting just to know what's going on in a parallel market. So I don't know if you've been keeping track of that, but it might be useful for a presentation to the legislature next year.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. That's a good point. I don't know, Travis, if there's anything you want to add based on the other tracks.
If you could back up a slide, Annalise. Yeah, I like the point you made, Sharon. There is a movement in the auto insurance industry toward a little bit increasingly, it's not at the pace maybe that was expected a few years ago, but increasingly to what they call usage-based insurance, which often is based exclusively or largely on how many miles you drive. So if you look at this in the equity context, vehicle insurance is what color is that? Sort of dark gray. It's 6% in the left-hand column of the lowest income group, and it's 1 or 2% in the highest income group. And we know that low-income households drive fewer miles than high-income households. We saw that in one of the earlier slides, significantly fewer miles, low-income households. So if you're looking at this bigger context of how can equity challenges be addressed more broadly with regard to transportation costs, there's huge chunks in this chart that are other than gas tax or RUC. It's the cost of owning a vehicle, it's the cost of insurance, it's the cost of maintenance. So taking a look at what's happening in the insurance market and whether a move to pay per mile insurance can cut into some of these higher relative costs that low-income households are facing is an example of a market opportunity that might be more meaningful than tinkering with something that's 1% or less than 1% of household costs, that is the gas tax.
And I really just would be at sort of the uptake, the percents of the insurance industry people. I don't pay any attention to what I get charged every year. I just pay it. Even though I know I've been driving so much less in the last 18 months. So it would be curious to me just to find out if people pay attention to these kind of signals. Thanks.
Thanks. Kelly,
Thanks for the
you
question.
may end
We'll look into that.
Yeah, this chart here, have we looked at it sort of under the RUC analysis? I mean, we're tackling sort of the 9% on the low income, portion of this chart. How does it look under the RUC scenario? Does it go from 9% to 7%? I mean, I'm just trying to get my mind around how much we're moving the needle, if at all, from an equity standpoint. I mean, I think what this chart shows us is the way that the gas tax, is applied is equal. If we looked at some of the other charts, the relative costs across structures may be equal, but we're obviously not equitable. And particularly when you layer in all the costs of transportation, we're not equitable. So, this study right now is focused on a narrow piece of this total transportation puzzle. And I'm just curious, kind of under a base scenario, whether or not, that does move the needle at all or not.
Jay, do you want to talk about the percent spent on fuel versus actual taxes?
Yeah, so the gas tax portion of that, the gas tax only represents about 1.4%. Well, if we're looking at the households at the lowest income bracket, 1.4% of household income on average, whereas for households making $150,000 or more. So it's really, it would be 0.2%. It's really the, I don't know if you can see it, the bar at the very bottom of this chart.
Yeah, I'm asking, what does that number look like under the RUC?
So our findings earlier showed that we weren't really seeing a statistically significant difference between costs under a gas tax versus a RUC. So I would suggest that it would probably be similar.
Right.
And so I don't know if you'd see much of a difference. And the shift, Kelly, I think would happen if more lower income households are able to go away from gas vehicles, then that 9% could go down. But for now, even under a
Right.
rock, you'd still be paying for the cost of fuel.
So the 1.4% is sort of embedded in that 9%. And what
Yeah.
we're saying is sort of under this base scenario that we're analyzing, we're not really moving the needle much for low income folks from an equity standpoint in terms of percentage paid of their total income, right? Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Before I go to Ed, I just want to acknowledge, Bryce, you have a good comment about, payment and whether or not you're paying, the gas tax, as we've talked about before, is a real pay as you go. I mean, if you want to put $2 of gas in, go ahead and you'll be taxed just on that amount. I think there will be a lot more conversation around frequency of payment. And I think it's something that Linda and Henry are already, I think, starting to hear in terms of the impact of things like an annual payment versus being able to pay as you go. So that is absolutely something that we will be looking at as we move further along. So Ed, I see your hand up, and if others can put your hand down if you've already, unless you have a new question.
So when I look at these numbers on slide 30, and it says that 40% of the household income is spent on transportation, I can't ignore everything else that I'm hearing. Granted, you're focused on this aspect alone, but I'm hearing that in order to only spend 30% of their income on housing, they would have to work twice as many hours as they currently do. So that means that's about 60% of their income is going to housing. And now you're telling me 40% is going to transportation. That's 100% of their income going to housing and transportation. That means they have no money to eat. They have no money to clothe themselves with. The question I'm getting at here is, are you looking and reconciling these numbers with any other numbers to see if they're actually making sense, or if there's something that's being double accounted or not being accounted for somewhere else that would skew these numbers higher than what the actual might be?
I don't know, Jay, do you want to, or Chloe, do you want to comment on the source, the computer expenditure survey? I mean, we know that lower income families often have very little left over. If they're below 30,000, they may be getting some assistance because they would be eligible for subsidized housing, which could help some with housing costs. But I think you're right that there's probably very little left over.
Yeah, I would just, so the source is a consumer expenditure survey. So we just, and that's based on households just responding how they spent their money, or how they spent their money over 1 year. And we just took the transportation part of their responses and incorporated it into this chart that you're seeing. And I would just also note that these are just costs for nationally as well, across a sample of national households, and they're on average across these different income groups. So I think we could look at, we didn't specifically look at how much housing is incorporated into the other 60%, but I would assume it would be quite high as well.
But again, it would be national, so it wouldn't look like the Seattle Metro. Okay. Senator King, did you have another question or comment?
I just had a comment along the lines of Representative Orcutt. As you look at this chart, yeah, it's quite dramatic, but I would say to his point and to mine is when you factor in what percentage the lower income families would pay for housing, for clothing, for food, you're going to have a chart that's very similar to what you see right here. So, it's all kind of relative in my opinion. So thank you.
Yep, thank you. All right. Brian. You're on mute, Brian.
Sorry, my phone rang at the instant I raised my hand. I don't know if there was a connection there. So Chloe made a comment about the data being 2017, 4 years old now, and that there's been more penetration by hybrids and electrics, and that as that number increases, that may affect this equity analysis. And I would say I agree with that, but only if the penetration of those electrics and hybrids by income class is disparate. Is that correct? If all the income classes, and this is a stretch, but if they all got the same numbers of hybrids and electrics in the same proportion, then this analysis applies. We know that those vehicles tend to be more expensive and maybe purchased by higher income brackets. But I don't know if it's a statistically significant change or not. Just wanted to clarify what Chloe was meaning by that.
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two elements to it. The first would be if just overall there were more electric vehicles and it didn't vary by income, it was just a higher proportion overall. What we would expect to see based on this analysis is that because there's more variation in vehicle fuel efficiency, mileage driven over the course of a year is having a little bit less of an impact, and vehicle fuel efficiency is having a little more of an impact. So that could slightly move the needle on the comparison between annual RUC and annual gas tax costs within an income bracket, for people under 30,000, then people between, the next income group. The other piece would be if there are more electric vehicles, but they are concentrated in certain income brackets, which seems likely, that we might see that needle being moved on the total annual RUC and gas tax costs, but only for certain income groups. So maybe now we're looking at, for just higher income groups, more electric vehicles, therefore they're paying even less they're paying less, not even less, they're paying less in gas tax, and RUC would be more comparatively because it is taking into account just miles driven and not vehicle fuel efficiency. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
I think so. My presumption was there would be equal penetration in all income groups. But
oh, okay.
Yeah, that's not likely going to happen, as you pointed out. So I guess the disparity, this analysis will be affected by that.
Right. Yeah. So I would say that it's in both cases there would be, whether it's sort of equal across income groups or concentrated in certain income groups, we would expect to see impacts on the results of this analysis in terms of RUC being. What we would probably expect to see is that RUC going a little bit higher in comparison to gas tax.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Chloe.
Oh, Chloe, could I interject? In your paper, and folks on the steering committee are having a chance to review it right now, there is a brief section on this specific question that refers to a Congressional Research Service study, again, based on 2017 data from the IRS that analyzes the federal electric vehicle tax credit by income. And it shows I think it's 70 or 80% of the tax credits were awarded to households with adjusted gross income over $100,000, and 7% to households with income over $1 million. So at least with regard to EV adoption in 2017, and this is analysis that we might look to the IRS to additional data to update with more recent years, that is indeed the trend, that they are going to higher income households.
All right. Well, as we mentioned, this is sort of the quantitative portion of the equity analysis. We fortunately have Linda and Henry out talking to people and hearing the sort of qualitative side of that. So I'm going to now turn it over to the two of them to talk through their approach and what they're finding so far.
Good morning. I'm Henry Yates of Yates Consulting. We're members of the Ford Drive team. I'm joined by Linda Kennedy, who I will turn this presentation over to shortly. As Allegra pointed out, we are doing equity outreach that relates to perceptions and concerns beyond the financial. Burke analysis is focused on the financial impact. Next slide, please. So our mandate, as you saw previously, is listed here. The method that we are using to achieve that mandate is extensive statewide outreach, personal outreach through a series of focus groups, which I'll talk about a little later, surveys and one-on-one interviews that we intend to conduct and have been conducting using some predetermined set of questions. Next slide. So, next slide, please. So the guidelines for our engagement are pretty broad here. We want to achieve some ethnic balance, geographic balance, statewide, urban areas, rural areas. We want to include people with disabilities who are generally referred to as more vulnerable populations, refugee, immigrant populations. And what we have done so far is conducted focus groups, which we'll talk about in more detail here, not only the focus groups that we've conducted, but also the results, early results of those focus groups. And we've not done a lot of quantitative work, putting together metrics and that sort of thing, because we've done about 7 of these focus groups. And in the next 30 days, we intend to do another 7 or 8, and we will get to about 25 to 30 towards the end of our work. Next slide, please. So a lot of groups are telling us that before they engage in a focus group, they want to talk with us about what this is about. So we are doing informational meetings with groups, and you can see some of the groups that we've met with, Bremerton NAACP, the Sikh Center of Seattle, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't really anticipate that people would want to know more about RUC and transportation funding prior to engaging any of their members in some sort of analysis. Next slide, please. So these are the focus groups that we've completed as of today. You see, we've done disability rights, Washington, Filipino Chamber of Commerce, Ahora Construction, which interestingly enough had a group of a couple of different ethnicities, Bremerton NAACP and some Seattle African Americans. We have not yet conducted a focus group in either Central or Eastern Washington, although we have a couple of those that we are just about at the stage of confirming. And we're looking at Spokane and Yakima specifically, although we do have one group that represents folks in Sunnyside, Pasco, Wenatchee, and Moses Lake. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do now is turn the presentation over to Linda Kennedy, and she'll talk about some of the observations that we got from the focus groups, which we think you'll find interesting. Again, we intend, after we do a number of these focus groups, to do some metrics, tabulate everything, and provide you with less of an anecdotal presentation and more fact-based and analytical. So, Linda?
Thanks, Henry, and good morning, everyone. These slides, again, deal with what people think. If we can go to the next slide. These opinions are people who don't usually pay attention or give much thought to what they pay for transportation. So we're looking at focus groups observations on the concept of RUC itself. There is great misunderstanding on current funding sources. Most of the respondents believe that they pay much higher rates for gas tax than they actually do. About 85% of those were way off way high on what they thought they paid. About 15% either knew about what they paid or just had no concept and couldn't even guess. So concerns about the RUC concept, it could be a disadvantage for people who can't stay home to work. They said that people who had higher incomes had more money and they didn't have to go to work. They could work from home. About 95% said that it was very biased. As for preferences, 4 of 5 groups indicated that it wasn't fair for electric vehicles not to pay for roads at all. Disability Rights Washington, a lot of those people said that that money should be invested in transit. If there is a road usage charge, make better mass transit and curb cuts, things that would make it easier for the disabled to get around. And most respondents said that heavier vehicles and those with studded tires should pay more. A bit more than half said that. About 40% even had examples. They said that people who have to drive, Uber drivers, pizza delivery people, things like that, people like that should pay, should not have to pay as much. It was really, really unfair to that group, again, because people who have money can work at home. And then people who earn less, they said that some people who earn less than a certain amount should not have to pay at all. And as we heard earlier from Chloe, there's no comprehensive measure in Washington state for what low income is, but they said that those who are low income should not have to pay if they're under a certain amount. If we move on to the next slide, the focus group observations on actually how they would report. There was a big concern about privacy and being tracked. Some participants said that they prefer to pay annually. Most of them said that, but a lot of them, about 20%, said they can't, that the tabs come in at a time when they're surprised. They didn't realize it was going to be right now. And then to have to pay the RUC on top of that, it's huge. And they aren't able to save to pay at the end of the year. There are some concerns about people cheating, that they would perhaps change the odometer if they use the concept of taking a photo of your odometer and then paying from that. And several proposed the concept of a mileage exemption. They said that good customer service is really important. A lot of times when they use tolls as an example, that when they have a problem with the tolls, that there's nobody there to help them. And so they see challenges with that and challenges with the payments. Again, these are people's opinions. They are based on what people think without knowing that much about a RUC, which is what we were trying to do because it's a focus group. We don't want to give too much away in the beginning or we won't get that clean slate that we're looking for. And with that, I'll turn it back to Henry. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. Let me talk about our future outreach plans, but before I do that, I want to kind of clarify the payment frequency issue. Only about 20% of the folks that we talk to prefer to pay annually like they do with their car tabs. About 80% or more want to pay on, would pay on a monthly basis. I will also point out that there was, I don't want to call it extreme, but there was some pushback on RUC when we first started talking about the issue. Once we explained what it was and the fact that some cars currently or some drivers currently don't pay, we found people to be more understanding, and I don't want to call it supportive, but more engaged in the discussion and believing that a RUC was a decent option for making sure that the roads do get paid for. So the next 30 to 90 days, we intend to do a bunch more focus groups, as I talked about previously. Any suggestions you might have, we would welcome. We're going to be in both Central and Eastern Washington doing focus groups. We're going to be doing some interviews. We have a survey that we put together, and then we'll do an analysis that we will be ready to present to you at the next opportunity. So with that, I will end my comments and turn it over to Rashini if there are no questions.
Henry, we have a question from Representative Orcutt. Representative Orcutt, please go ahead.
So I have a question. You know, you ask them what they think about RUC, and then you go back and explain to them how RUC would work, and then you get their opinions again on it, and you kind of able to test the before and after. But I also noticed that there was a response in here that they think the money should be going to transit, but the gas tax doesn't currently go to transit. Are you going back and letting them know that the current gas tax doesn't go back to transit, so that if they wanted to do something, there would have to be either a legislative change in the way the money is distributed, or that it would have to be an increase in the amount collected above what is currently a gas tax, or what would be a gas tax equivalent? I mean, it seems like these are two different, two very similar things, that you're giving corrective advice on one, but you're not giving corrective advice on the other, and then getting their their input based on the actual factual status.
So Representative Orcutt, we only had one group that talked about monies from RUC going to transit, and we did correct their, well, we explained to them that presently none of the gas tax money goes to transit. And some of them said, we understand that, we think there ought to be a change. So we did do the correction of their perception, or potential perception, that gas tax money is used for transit. And like I said, it was one out of 6 groups that we've spoken with at this point, and the people who brought it up were from Disability Rights Washington. Is that sufficient? Did I answer your question?
You did. Thank you.
Sure. And by the way, I do have to say that we have done our best to correct any misperceptions, and there are many. Whenever we're talking to people in these focus groups, we want them to have good factual information and not be assuming things that are not the case. And I can give you several examples of that, but we always provide clarification when we hear misstatements being made.
I don't think legislators need to be told what all of the misperceptions about anything might be out there. Trust me, we've already heard them all.
Right.
I don't see any more hands raised, Henry.
Okay.
Oh, no, actually, I'm standing corrected. Senator King has just raised his hand.
Trying to unmute here. So you know, and I'm not sure how relevant it is, but as I think about people and where they live, and using RUC and not using RUC, and you know, there are individuals that may live in a community where transit is available to them just about any time they want to use it, and then there are those that would use transit once in a while, and then use their car, and then there's those that their only way to get to work and is to drive a car, but yet those that own a car but may be able to use transit most of the time still want those roads to be there, and still want to be able to get in that car and go whenever they want to go, where there are others that don't have the option, they just have to take their car. And so there's that kind of a disparity as well that I think somewhere along the line has to be factored in as to whether or not you might stagger the amount per mile, so that those that travel smaller, fewer miles a year may pay a little more than those that that travel more because of the fact that they want the roads there when they want the roads there. Anyway, just a thought.
Thank you.
And Representative Orcutt again.
Senator King, are you implying that the buses they use for transit are also using the roads?
Not trying to imply it. They obviously are. Obviously the bus systems are pretty well subsidized when you look at what people pay. I'm not saying that isn't right or wrong. I'm just saying that's all part of the equation when you start to look at what we do in transportation.
All right, well, great discussion, and thanks to all the presenters. Roshini, why don't you move us in? We're just about on schedule to the next segment on the innovation research.
Very well, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Roshini Duran with CDM Smith, and I'm the lead on the research and innovation task. So let's get into the next slide. So if you could click through, please. Just a brief refresher on this one. This task was originally called Mileage Reporting Enhancements, but we really prefer calling it RUC Innovation to capture the somewhat more expansive nature of our research, because we're not just trying to enhance mileage reporting methods here, but also looking into emerging technologies that have never been tested, at least not in the past Washington pilot. And then we're also looking beyond technologies to systems and processes that can be organized to deliver RUC more efficiently and also with an improved user experience. And then another very important aspect is that we'll be looking at additional business models. It could be from the public or the private sector that could support RUC efficiently. And when we mean efficiently, we mean with a lower cost of collection often. Next slide, please. I'll now explain briefly how this research is organized, just as a reminder, because I know some of you are pretty familiar with that. So we basically have 3 research tracks running concurrently. The first one is building on past efforts and trying to see what improvements can be made to mileage reporting methods and processes. And then reaching out to existing and new public and private sector partners, and then exploring new opportunities, not only in the transport and mobility world, but also public utility companies. And generally, we'll look at trends in the consumer world. And as we do this, we'll coordinate with teams working on task 2, the equity and mitigation task, and the other track, which is the cost reduction strategies. And all of this will culminate into what we call RUC scenarios that will be tested in sub-pilots. Next slide, please. Okay, so here the idea is not to do a repeat of what we did in the first Washington pilot, that is a single big pilot with many participants, but to break it into smaller subtests that would focus on a couple of RUC scenarios that build on enhanced mileage reporting methods and payment methods, and in general, streamline RUC processes. And when we mean streamline, we mean something that can offer a better user experience in general, and again, reduce the cost of collection in general. So later, Travis and I will walk you through a preliminary list of pilot opportunities that we prepared. So the update I'll be giving you will help prime you for this discussion. So I'll walk you through the framework we have built to capture the research opportunities. So next slide, please. So I'll get started and talk about the policy drivers that are guiding our research. Next slide, please. So we have 4 overarching themes: equity, user choice, user experience, and cost reduction. And nested under those themes, you will find, and I'll explain that in the next slides, familiar topics: privacy, convenience, simplicity, and all the other policy guidelines we've been talking about, but we've nested them over these overarching themes because there's a lot of overlap. Next slide, please. We'll try to move into the first one, equity. Thank you. So here we focus on one dimension, and that is the systems and operational equity aspect. And we'll look at offering what we call relevant and simple options to users that are convenient and accessible. And we'll also look into using clear language, especially when it relates to participant agreements, privacy policies, so that drivers and users can understand what exactly they're opting into. We'll also be promoting compliance by design, meaning make it easy for people to comply naturally. And this will ultimately lead to, or can ultimately lead to, reduced enforcement costs. And finally, if users, and that is very likely, are have to make several choices when they involve their vehicles and choose between a variety of mileage reporting options, assist those users so that they can make the best decision. Thank you. Can you please move to the next slide? Thank you. Consumer choice. So here, it's not a matter of offering unlimited choice, providing, again, relevant and cost-efficient choices to drivers depending on typical situations in which they are. And the term situations will come in often, and by that we mean what equipment do they have and what are their preferences. So there's some I guess, intersectionality between those different dimensions when we talk about user situations, and I'll walk you through that. One thing I want to insist on is we're mapping the choices that exist. We're not saying that we have to have a laundry list of choices just because they're possible. Next choice, next slide, please. User experience. So this basically is how to balance the need for transparency with simplicity and make it convenient for the user so that it's easy to comply with the buck. Next slide. Cost reduction. So obviously the system should be cost efficient, but in order to measure how efficient it is, it will be important for us to define common terminology for the cost elements that are used across business models so that we can be sure that we're talking about the same things and that we're using benchmarks that make sense, and that we're comparing what is comparable. So as we move forward, we're going to use these 4 themes as lenses for our research. This means as every time we evaluate a new an innovation that comes our way or that we are finding, we try to see whether it meets those policy priorities first before we consider it as a relevant option for pilot testing. Now I'm going to move into the framework and explain what the user situations are. So I'll get into the possible choices that could be offered depending on the situations that users can be in using the 2 dimensions. So this is what I call a 2-dimensional framework that we set up to identify which mileage reporting technology that we could offer based on where the user is at and what equipment the user has and what preference the users have. So what I will do in the next slides, I'll first explain the horizontal dimension, and then I'll go across the vertical dimension, and then we'll go over the framework. So when we cover the horizontal dimension, what we did is that we tried to map the type of equipment the users have or types of vehicles the users have. And if we go from left to right, we see that users can find themselves in different situations, depending on what they have. So if they do not have any connected phone and their vehicle is not compatible, meaning you cannot outfit a device or put any object in the car to allow the car to be connected to a RUG platform, then obviously they would need some assistance, but we'll get to that later. And then you have people who are in a situation where they have a smartphone or a phone that has a web browser, and they have what we call a compatible vehicle, a vehicle that can have software drawing data out of it through a third-party interface or a third-party device that can be plugged into the vehicle, for example. And on the other extreme, you have native people who have a connected vehicle, that is native connectivity. They don't have to do anything. They just have to enable the in-vehicle telematics in their vehicle to be connected. Now we'll move to the other dimension, reporting preferences. So this is, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you're fine,
Oh,
Roshini.
oh, thank you. So this is, these are the different reporting preferences that we'd have to consider. So going from top to bottom, we see that some users could prefer assisted reporting and could be inline assistance or online or in person. This generally means more touch points, meaning more interactions with an entity. It could be public or private, and potentially more costly because there are more interactions. And then one level down, you have what we call self-reporting. So it's an self-reporting means an active way of reporting, and a manual action is generally involved. And generally, the system helps with a few reminders because the manual action is involved. And then we have fully automated reporting, which is what I would call a passive form of reporting because no action is needed and usually technology does the job. Generally, there are fewer touch points and it's potentially less costly, especially if there are no additional devices to add. So now I will move over to the full framework. Okay, so, so here we mapped the typical choices you would give people finding themselves in the situation where you had the process. As an example, you have no connectivity whatsoever. You need to have at least assisted reporting. If you have third-party connectivity, it makes sense to provide self-reporting options or fully automated options. And people who have native connectivity ideally would use the fully automated option, or because their vehicles are compatible, could also eventually use the self-reporting option, but we don't have it here. Now, if we move to, I'll move to the next slide and show you what we actually offered in the first Washington pilot. So in the first Washington pilot, we actually covered the cases that we see in green. So the no connectivity options we addressed by providing the VLO, Vehicle Licensing Officer's in-person services. And for third-party connectivity, we had tested the ODO, what do you call the ODO photo or odometer image capture solution that was done through a smartphone app. And then we also had the plug-in device that was tested. We didn't test any native connectivity in Washington. So now that as we move forward to the next phase of this pilot, we're trying to figure out where are the gaps. I mean, if you look at the blank cells here, we're trying to figure out what options we could offer that could be relevant. So first we started by figuring out what is feasible. And then we will analyze whether, according to user preferences, we should be providing these options. If you move to the next slide, we'll see how we mapped new reporting choices that could be offered. So I'm not going to walk through all of them. I'm just going to pick two examples to see where we're going with that. So I'll pick two extremes across the diagonal here. I'll pick the user who finds himself or herself in a situation of no connectivity whatsoever, but who maybe could benefit from a fully automated option. And in this case, we're looking at whether what we call VIN lookup services through companies like Carfax or AutoCheck, if that could be a viable option for users to passively report their odometer readings, because when they go to service their vehicles, they have their odometer readings taken by the service agents, and these are collected and reported to Carfax ultimately. So the question we're asking ourselves is that, is this something we can leverage to make it less painful for people who do not have access to connectivity? And now I'll go to the other extreme of people who are fully equipped. So we're going to top right to the native connectivity, people with native connectivity, but who may want to have in-person assistance just because that's their preference, or maybe they decided not to activate the in-vehicle telematics package that they have in their vehicles for road usage charging. So that is a possibility that we need to map out, we feel, to see whether it is a relevant choice to offer. If we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so So these actually, please move back. I just want to insist on the fact that this is one framework. Can you move back up one slide, please? Yes, so this is one framework that captures across 2 dimensions, that captures what is possible in terms of mileage reporting options. There's no time today to do that, but we are building similar frameworks for other options that we should be giving to users. For example, payment. We should be mapping it out to see what we offered and whether there are different payment modes, payment means, and payment plans that we should be offering. But that is another exercise for another day. But I just wanted to let you know that we're looking at other frameworks to capture other parts of the road usage charge process. Now we can move to the next slide. I'm going to explain how our approach to industry outreach. So if you recall, in the last pilot, we worked with I will say the usual players, the ones who have been certified in previous in RUC programs or have gathered experience in RUC pilots. So today, what we're trying to do is to look beyond the current business models we're working with and try to have broader conversations with other potential players who are showing interest in the RUC model. So as we have those conversations, we start explaining how RUC works, we explain a few criteria, and then these conversations help us identify what business capability we should be testing that could help us support some of the policy priorities that we have: reducing cost of collection, providing an equitable, hitting the systems and operational equity guidelines, and also providing a good user experience. If you could advance to the next slide, please. Okay, so here on the left, we've listed the players we've already worked with in past pilots and in RUC programs. You have usage-based insurance account managers. We had, if you recall, IMS in the first Washington pilot. We have tolling account managers that interfaced with usage-based insurance account managers and also technology providers in the first Washington pilot. We had Immovis and A2B, 2 companies. And then we have technology providers like Vicon, for example, that provided odometer capture image technology. And we also had fleet telematic service providers. We had Azuga participating in the interoperability test that we conducted with Oregon. So what we want to avoid doing is doing the same thing with the same players. So we're looking at the ecosystem and trying to figure out who has the building blocks to fully support the RUC process or part of the RUC process. And the reason I want to do that is because they may have some business capability that could allow us to reduce some RUC function. And it could be interesting as we invite more players to the RUC market to see how competition can help drive down costs, for example. So if you, can you move to the next slide, please? I'll just go over the few things that we are bringing up in our conversations with industry partners. Well, first, obviously, we try to gauge interest. Why are they getting in this? Why do they want to participate in pilot tests? We want to make sure that they allow us to support the policy priorities. It's not just an opportunity to test a new solution that they have. It has to be relevant to what we're trying to test and to RUC, obviously. So what we ask, first of all, is what is their ability to support core RUC functions? And that would be collecting mileage data, processing mileage data, issuing invoices, and sending reports to state administrations. So these are a few examples of core RUC functions. And in general, we are in general, I would say, a little bit more prescriptive over what core RUC functions they should deliver. And then we tend to give them a little bit more freedom when it comes to offering enhanced services around improved mileage reporting methods, because that is where we are we give them that freedom because we want to discover what else they can offer that could increase the user experience and also drive down the costs. And we're also very interested to see what they could do in terms of supporting flexible payment options. We obviously asked them to align with objectives that we set. I talked about policy priorities and how important it was for us to make sure that anything they offer is relevant to what we're trying to support. And then in general, we asked them whether they have the ability to address typical RUC issues that we generally struggle with, how to capture out-of-state travel and balance that with privacy concerns, and how to make sure the user experience is less clunky and as painless as possible. With that, I will conclude my part of the presentation, and I will check in with Allegra to see whether I have time to entertain a few questions. Travis.
There is time for a few questions. We have a couple of minutes, and while I wait to see if any hands are raised, I just want to underscore the last point on the last bullet that probably bears repeating. Although the focus of your presentation was on the 4 policy priorities of equity, user choice, user experience, and cost reduction, we are of course always thinking about privacy as one of the key public acceptance issues. And when it comes time to put some of these ideas out on the road for a test, we certainly will be considering what are the implications and opinions that arise from some of these new ways of thinking about how to assemble a RUC system. What are the implications for privacy and how can we manage that? I don't see any hands raised, so I'll slowly move into the next one in case someone's racing to click the button. But if not, thank you, Roshini, very much. And we'll hear from you again in a few minutes when we talk about the pilot test concepts that we're going to be floating for steering committee discussion today and final decisions in December. Well, that takes us into the last update presentation on the Forward Drive research on cost reduction. So I will take this section, and Annalise, if you could please take us to the next slide. A couple of thought questions that were in the Spotlight session for those of you who attended the Spotlight session in June on cost of collection. What is an acceptable cost of collection for RUC? And when is that cost acceptable? This is a question that, of course, we want it to be as low as possible. The gas tax is very inexpensive to collect, but what's our target? We will be, as you'll see in the presentation and some of the additional research and pilot testing, striving to get it down as low as possible. But it'd be helpful to have a target, either in the near term or the long term. So it'd be helpful if you have thoughts on that to offer. And also, what are the trade-offs? So there are ways that we could reduce cost significantly, but there might be trade-offs for user experience, for the efficiency from the user's perspective. It might be cheaper for the state to administer, but it might require users to do a little bit more on their end, for example. So what are those trade-offs, and what is acceptable in the name of reducing cost? So with that, as framing questions, next slide, please. Why it's important, of course, RUC is a funding policy tool. So if you can collect the funding efficiently, that leaves more for investment in the state's roads and bridges. To date, the small scale RUC systems here in the US have had high unit costs because there's a small number of vehicles in them in Utah and Oregon. If you look at New Zealand, which has a large scale RUC system with a manual approach, it's actually quite a low cost overall, but we don't know whether that is translatable at a large scale here. So we want to understand how to get there. And we know that the choices we make, policy choices and system design choices, are going to influence what that cost ends up being. So if you do enact a small scale system and you make some policy and design choices today for a small scale RUC system, for example, on electric or hybrid vehicles, what are you setting yourself up for a larger scale system in the future? And how can you ensure that you're on a trajectory to have relatively low costs in the future when more and more vehicles come into it? Next slide, please. Putting in context, I presented this slide at the Spotlight session, and this was sort of national benchmark numbers on other types of transportation taxes and fees and what it costs to collect as a % of revenue. I'm not going to show it very long. I'm going to ask Annalise to advance to the next slide because we had a request to show, well, what is it in Washington? So we did a little bit of research to narrow the ranges and look specifically in Washington. And this is the updated picture with Washington numbers. So fuel tax actually a little bit less than 1%, about I think 0.7 or 0.8%. Vehicle fees is right at about 8%. All electronic tolling between 13 and 18%. And then of course, express lanes, which are not purely designed for revenue collection. They're designed for managing traffic and optimizing speeds. So would necessarily expect the cost of collection to be low. But as a result, the percentage of cost relative to revenue collected is a little bit higher at 25% and up, depending on the specific facility. Where does RUC fit in? If you could advance one, Annalise, we know that the large scale RUC system needs to be somewhere in the ballpark of less than 10%, we presume. Where it will land is a function of the decisions we make in the system design, as well as the decisions the legislature makes for policy. We also know that a small scale system is going to have those high unit costs, but where it starts is also a function of those design decisions we make. How low can we get a small scale RUC system? Can we get it below 25% in the early days? That's a question that we want to be able to answer through some of the research and pilot testing over the next few months. So moving into how we are undertaking this research. First, we have a cost analysis framework. You can go ahead, advance to the next one after this. One more. There we go. This is a repeat of what you guys that were at the spotlight session saw, so I'll try to go through it quickly. But we basically broke it down into 9 functions. If you can do these 9 things, you can have a road usage charge system, and I'll walk through each one by one. So next slide. First, you have to be able to identify vehicles and create an account for those vehicles, which means connecting to the vehicle registry at the Department of Licensing. And in the 2 existing RUC systems in Utah and Oregon, that's exactly what they do with their respective vehicle registries at those states' DMVs. There's an enrollment step in those 2 states that requires customers to select an account manager or at least a mileage reporting method. It's not an essential step that you enroll or that you select a mileage reporting method. It's possible to have that piece done more automated, but there is nevertheless the need to identify the vehicle and connect it at minimum to the vehicle registry. And we know that by working on enrollment, in addition to reducing costs, we can reduce pain for participants, because from not only the Washington pilot, but some of the other pilots we've seen around the country, enrollment is typically the biggest pain point for participants. Once they get enrolled, they find it relatively easy, but that first few steps of understanding what the choices are, if there's technology to deal with or install, that creates a lot of friction and a lot of opportunities for cost reduction as a result. Next slide. Once you do have vehicles identified and enrolled, we need to generate the road usage data. Sounds fairly trivial. There's a lot of ways to generate road usage data. In the Oregon and Utah systems, it's done with the plug-in devices or with in-vehicle telematics. In New Zealand, it's done through pre-purchased distance licenses, so you're actually paying in advance and then using the odometer to ensure that you're within the license limits. And we tested a bunch of other methods in Washington, including a smartphone app, manual odometer verification, and of course, smartphone odometer image capture. So there's a lot of ways to capture the data, or generate the data. It's just a matter of selecting an array of choices that is acceptable and palatable and useful for vehicle owners, and then implementing it in a way that is cost effective. This, by the way, I'll hover here for a second. This is an example from the prompt question at the beginning of trade-offs. We know that user choice is valuable. We know that customers have said they like having choices. On the other hand, there are some choices that are more expensive than others to instrument and to operate. So trading off some of the more fully featured user choices in the name of cost reduction could be a priority. It could be a policy preference, but it's an important question to put those trade-offs into context. Next slide, please. Once the data are generated from the vehicle about how many miles it has traveled, there needs to be a way to access the data. And of course, with the electronic reporting methods, the data can be accessed remotely and wirelessly. But there are other ways to access the data through more manual intervention, for example, by keying it in on a computer terminal, or on the user can do it on a web browser or through a smartphone. Next slide, please. Once you have access to the data, simple calculation: how many miles, what's the rate, multiply those two numbers, and that generates the amount of charges due. In Oregon, a fuel tax credit is applied either by measuring fuel consumed and subtracting that from the total, or by estimating it based on the EPA fuel economy rating and the miles driven. The account managers in both Utah and Oregon are responsible for doing the calculations, but of course it could just as well be done by a public agency like the Department of Licensing, who already has a lot of experience calculating vehicle fees, for example, and applying sophisticated rate tables for things like the car tabs, the vehicle weight fees, and the sound transit tabs as well. Next slide, please. Once the rates are charged, an invoice is generated, or a statement of charges, perhaps is a better way to put it. For example, when you do renew your vehicle, before you actually click the pay button, you are shown a display of, if you're using the online portal, you're shown a display that details the charges, the breakdown of various fees and optional add-ons. So generating that invoice is a part of the process. Next slide. Once you've seen the invoice, of course, got to pay. So collecting payment, this is not trivial. There is a cost, especially to paying, for example, with credit and debit cards. There is a cost associated to that, whether it's being collected by a third-party account manager or by a state agency. Credit card fees. Bank transfers tend to be lower cost. Under the gas tax, you have a small number of tax collectors who tend to pay through bank transfers directly to the Department of Licensing. So you're avoiding the friction of the payment itself having a cost. Whereas with the road usage charge with direct consumer payments, if you're offering credit card option, as DOL does, for example, with tab renewals, there is an additional cost. Now, a policy choice here, or a system design choice, is whether that cost can be passed on to the consumer. So if you do choose to pay by credit card, is that additional 3% or so something that can be passed on to customers who choose to pay that way or not? That's a design question to be decided. Next slide. Once a payment is made, a receipt is generated, verifying that the payment has been received and that the vehicle is compliant. And next slide after this, please. Enforcement. As Roshini mentioned, one of the emphases on our work in the RUC Innovation task is how can we make compliance easier? How can we make it such that participants in a RUC program comply without noticing it, or comply more easily, such that enforcement becomes less necessary? But you do obviously still need, in any tax system or any fee system, some level of enforcement. So by increasing compliance, by making the design of the system better, you reduce the amount of enforcement, but you don't eliminate the need for it. So we are focusing in our research on both, reducing the need for it, but also finding ways to actually apply enforcement techniques that are cost effective. And this is the subject of one of the workshops that I'll mention in a moment. Last but not least, once the money is collected, it needs to be put into the appropriate fund, the highway fund. And this is a fairly trivial step that we've explored with DOL and Treasury already in past work in Washington. Okay, so that, if you go to the next slide, just to recap, is the 9 functional elements of a RUC system that we are looking at. And the research task that we are undertaking, as we previewed with you all at the spotlight session and is now underway, is to conduct a series of workshops with partners from other states on 3 subject matters that we believe we can benefit from, not only the lessons of what other states are doing, but also potentially multi-state collaboration in how to deliver some of these functions or combinations of functions more cost effectively. So we'll talk about what 3 workshops we have now down selected to with our partner states from Oregon and Utah. And of course, the Department of Licensing is a participant in this research as well. So next slide, please. The first workshop is going to be around enforcement, and each workshop has guiding it a challenge statement, which we'll read on the next slide. And that is design a low-cost enforcement regime that captures a relatively high percentage of violation events. It's a very concise statement. We want to leave a lot of space for the workshop participants to come up with innovative ideas and clever approaches without overly constraining the prompt, the challenge statement. We do, however, if you could advance one, please, have a few additional questions that we would ask during the workshop or at the end of the workshop. We would like to assess the effectiveness of the design at capturing every dollar and whether it's even necessary to capture every dollar. And how can we improve those design functions at a reasonable cost? We want to assess the efficiency and effectiveness of multi-state enforcement systems specifically. If there is a multi-state agreement and legal authority for a multi-state agreement, how can those multi-state enforcement systems be done in a way that's more effective to justify it, as opposed to each state handling enforcement individually? And then the last bullet related to that is if there are improvements that are identified, what changes are needed in enabling law to allow those features to be put into place. The second workshop, if you could advance to the next slide, please, will cover customer service, which touches on a number of the 9 functional elements. Customer service basically relates to any interaction with the vehicle owners who are paying a road usage charge, from enrollment to mileage reporting, receiving an invoice, paying that invoice, and then receiving an acknowledgement of payment or a receipt. And there's of course also when folks have problems or need help, there's a customer service function to help folks through this process that cuts across all these functions. So if you could advance to the next slide, our challenge statement on customer service reads pretty simple: design a customer service center at low cost of operations. Again, very broad statement. But the idea here is, are there best practices from other customer service centers that we can implement in a RUC system, particularly by working across state borders? And a few considerations on the next slide, please. Around designing customer service center, we want to assess the effectiveness at maintaining customer satisfaction and compliance. So again, going back to, if customer service is designed well, if the system is designed well, you get a higher degree of compliance and a lower need for enforcement. And then again, at the bottom, assessing the functionality of multi-state cooperation. Is it even feasible to have multi-state customer service? What are the design features? What are the mileage reporting methods that would need to be held in common across states in order to have a multi-state customer service function even be feasible in the first place? So these are the types of questions we'll be exploring in the workshop on customer service. Third and finally, procurement and certification. As we know, a lot of the functions of a road usage charge system could be outsourced to third-party vendors, technology vendors, customer service providers, account management service providers. So this touches almost all of the 9 functional elements. The only one it doesn't touch necessarily is enforcement. Enforcement is almost always reserved as a function for public agency, but almost everything else can be outsourced. Whether it is a design choice, but if it is, there needs to be a process for procuring and certifying the performance of the vendors that are providing these services. So the challenge statement on the next slide that is associated with this area is to design a regional procurement process for RUC vendors using a market contract that is accessible by multiple states through service level agreements. What does that mean? That means typically states have individual state procurement laws that agencies must follow when they are outsourcing functional elements of a system. Is there a way to create a market of RUC service providers that are certified, that meet the standards that are held in common among states, or potentially also that meet additional standards of individual states, like if Washington were to have a separate set of specifications? Is there a way to create a market of RUC vendors that is sort of pre-certified, that can reduce the need for a costly procurement process, that reduces the number of vendors to one, usually, This is what Oregon has done with their system. They have an open market concept that allows any vendor that is certified to supply RUC services to end customers. There are a couple of analogs in Washington, and DOL has discussed with us a couple of examples that they already are aware of, such as the interlock devices, where you have a certified set of vendors and consumers can choose from that list which one they would prefer to interact with, as opposed to only having one vendor that's selected by the agency. So this workshop will explore in some detail, is it possible to create a regional approach like that, where you could offload some of the costs to one individual state by working across multiple states to create that open market and allow any state to efficiently access the vendors that are on that certified list. Next slide, please. A few considerations for this procurement and certification workshop. We want to be able to compare, is it actually as effective as we think it might be? Is a market contract negotiated by multiple states preferable to individual vendor purchase contracts? We want to consider whether a regional body could certify the vendors but leave the actual procurement to the individual states, as opposed to a regional procurement as a possibility. And then thirdly, related to that, consider the region certifying account managers as one concept for how a RUC system could be implemented. And then finally, the question of would having an open market actually improve competition among vendors? We of course believe it can, that's the theory, but we want to test that hypothesis through this workshop. So I said there were three, I presented three, but I lied. There is a fourth and new, go ahead, next slide. There is a fourth new workshop that we are conducting this week, kind of around this steering committee meeting, just with some members of the project team on manual reporting. And it's too bad that Senator Fortunato couldn't join us today. This workshop was inspired by his remarks at the Spotlight session in June on this very topic. So we have set ourselves the challenge of designing a low-cost approach for manually reporting miles driven. And we want to do that in a way that captures sufficient data as a basis for a RUC assessment. We want to do it in a way that is simple for motorists, and we want to do it in a way that is, despite the simplicity, also still auditable and enforceable. And Senator Fortunato talked through a vision for such a system on that Spotlight call, if you heard it. So we sort of use that as the outline for a more detailed exploration of what would be possible and what could be achieved with a manual system for drivers. And we hope to have the results of that to present either in the next Spotlight session in the fall on this topic, or indeed at the full steering committee meeting in December. Next slide. Okay, so that concludes the cost of collection workshop highlights. I'll pause here for questions and comments before we get into the final section of today's presentation, which is to discuss what features we would like to take from all that you've heard today and put out on the road for pilot testing. And we'll start with a question from Senator King.
Thank you, Travis. I'm just curious as to, do we know what the costs are that Oregon is experiencing, what their overall cost is of collection?
So there's several elements to the cost of collection. Most of the costs are outsourced to the third-party vendors, and the market contract, which I alluded to in the procurement workshop that we'll be having, the market contract that Oregon has currently calls for the vendors keeping 40% of the revenue they collect. Obviously, that is an unsustainably high number for a large-scale program. They only have about 1,000 or so vehicles in the program. So 40% of revenue of 1,000 vehicles for a vendor to be willing to even supply the service in the first place is a number that was negotiated and necessary. But Oregon, I believe, is also looking at how can they renegotiate those contracts when they get to a higher scale program with more vehicles. But that's the number they're working with today with only 1,000 vehicles.
All right. Thank you.
Sharon.
Yes, I just want to say I really applaud this idea of the cross-jurisdictional procurement organization. you know, having worked in utility regulation where the federal state jurisdiction were very jealously guarded by each agency. I think this is a heroic effort, but I really think it will, if you believe in markets, it will help lower costs. So I will be really interested in hearing how this workshop turns out. So good job.
Well, reserve the applause until we actually have some results, but we appreciate the the encouragement.
Well, I really hope it, you know, hope over experience. I hope that you can find some way to do this. This is great.
Very good. Senator King.
Yeah, sorry to keep asking questions, but are
No,
we
please, that's what we're
planning,
here
are
for.
we planning on billing or collecting from non-residents, people that are visiting our state, or trucks that are delivering from Canada or Oregon or Idaho or Chicago? Or
So for the heavy vehicle fleet, there currently is a mechanism for reapportioning the fuel tax called IFTA, the International Fuel Tax Agreement. So trucks that are coming in from Canada and any of the lower 48 states are required to report miles driven by jurisdiction and report fuel purchased by jurisdiction. And then there's a reconciliation that then reallocates the taxes they've paid to whichever state they've already paid it, that reallocates it such that Washington receives the share that it is due for the miles driven by those trucks in this state. And that's the case, obviously, for all of the other jurisdictions that participate in that program as well. For the light duty fleet, for passenger cars that cross borders, we explored that question in the first pilot of what is the feasibility of attaching a road usage charge to visitors coming in from out of state. And we did it with the GPS option. We needed to know, where are your miles driven by jurisdiction? We didn't record specifically where you drove. We recorded how many miles you drove in Oregon, how many miles you drove in Washington, Idaho, British Columbia, and we were able to apportion the taxes collected to the drivers based on the miles they drove in those jurisdictions, with different rates applied, since each state had its own RUC rate. And then on the backside, we were able to flow those funds to the state that it was due, sort of like we followed the IFTA model, in fact, for doing that. Whether the state wanted to approach that in a live system, there are a lot of ways to do it. We tested the one, again, that had the GPS approach. There are other ways that perhaps are more invasive, requiring users to purchase mileage permits at the border, for example, which you can already think of some ways why that might impede travel. So it's been floated, but there are also some approaches that involve a lot less intervention with drivers that basically rely on states working together to estimate miles traveled without actually applying the specific breakdown of miles to individual drivers. So we're not specifically tackling that question in this series of pilots. We have a lot of findings from the last pilot, but it remains an open policy question as to whether you would want to apply a RUC to out-of-state vehicles, but you have choices if you did want to do that as to how.
well, thank you. The reason that it's important, from my standpoint anyway, is part of my district runs along the Columbia River. And of course, if we're not charging for RUC and Oregon is, people are going to cross and come up the Washington side and not be charged for the 50 or 60 or 100 miles, however far they travel. So anyway, just wanted to clarify it. So thank you.
Well, I should mention the conclusion from the last pilot, which was, just as a reminder, as an interim solution, keeping the gas tax in place is the most effective way to capture revenue from miles driven by visitors from Oregon, assuming they fill up on this side of the river.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other hands raised. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. Feel free to weigh in with questions at any time on any of these topics, but seeing no questions, I'm going to go ahead and move into the last segment of our meeting today, which is intended to be a discussion, and I'll close with the same questions at the end of this section that we started with. I'd love to hear feedback, comments, ideas, and questions, of course, about where we're trending. And I'm going to invite Roshini to come on and help me co-present some of these concepts. So Annalise, if you could go to the next slide. There is a typology of pilot tests, and we call them sub-tests because, as Roshini mentioned earlier, we're not looking to recreate or do over the large-scale statewide pilot with thousands of participants who have the full experience from enrollment to mileage reporting to invoicing for 9 months or 12 months. Rather, we're looking to test some of these features and components that we've been talking about over the last few presentations, both here and in the spotlight sessions. So there's 3 different ways to think about subtests. One is as a technology proof of concept. So if there is a new technology that hasn't yet been fielded or tested for road usage charge or anywhere, in fact, the focus would be on feasibility. Can it work in the first place? Secondly, looking at new business capabilities that may exist out in the marketplace for applications other than RUC, we would want to import them basically into RUC and see could they work to help reduce the cost of collection in the first place. But also, as Roshini mentioned earlier, we're always looking at the user experience. So that's a second category of tests around business capabilities. And then the third one, which is more focused on the user experience, is service concept testing. We're gauging not only the user's experience, but their acceptance of the product and the concept. If the experience is smoother and better and easier for folks to comply, easier to pay, not only do they have a better experience, but perhaps they have a more ready acceptance of the policy. So we call those the service focus set of tests. So we have 5 different emerging concepts that we want to present today. These are the 5 relatively more fully formed ones, but we have others waiting in the wings. And of course, we're inviting you all to provide other ideas to us today. So go ahead and advance, please, Annalise, to the next one. The first concept is to look at, for a subtest, deploying what we call a minimum viable manual RUC system. So this is a pretty busy slide. Let me break it down. In the upper left corner, we have the 3x3 grid that Roshini presented, which was our framework for examining on one dimension what kind of connectivity customers have, and on the other dimension, what level of assistance they would prefer or require. So we see a minimum viable manual system as addressing the 2 upper left cells in the grid on the left-hand row. So this informs a lot of the research areas that we're focusing on. It informs the equity research in that a manual system could require no change or very little change to existing processes. And what we're expecting to find, and indeed finding in some of the early research that Henry and Linda are doing, is that one of the concerns from low-income communities is privacy, just like with the public more generally. But also what is the reporting requirement going to look like? Is there going to be a technology requirement? So if there's a manual approach that's viable, that requires no change or very little change to what folks are already used to, this could help address some of the equity concerns around a technology-driven RUC system. We're also looking at exploring through a manual system design whether we can introduce those periodic payments, which we've heard about several times already today. It also addresses cost effectiveness. If you can leverage existing processes, for example, the tab renewal process, perhaps the marginal cost of collecting a road usage charge on top of that is very low and doesn't require any new technology, so you avoid the costs of technology altogether. And then lastly, with regard to user experience, folks who are complying and renewing their vehicle tabs presumably are familiar with the process, whether they do it online or at a subagent. May require some adjustments, but we want to look at whether those adjustments would be feasible, what would it take for DOL, and what would it look like for customers. So all of these are aspects of what could become a pilot test of a manual RUC collection system, even if it's just a desktop exercise to walk through the steps. we think it could address all three of the priority focus areas of equity, cost of collection, and user experience. The second one on the next slide is, next slide, please. There we go. Collaborating with, oh, nope, back up one. We're on 88. There we are. Collaborating with retail partners for mileage reporting and payment. So the venues for actually reporting and paying road usage charge in the pilots to date have been largely virtual. You pay online, you pay through your phone, you have an automatic account with a credit card or debit card set up where it automatically charges. What about linking into payment networks that are already out there to either provide the mileage reporting service or collect the payment? And again, we think this can address the priority focus areas of equity, cost effectiveness, and user experience. So you can see on the grid on the upper left, it applies to the three levels of connectivity across the first row for folks who require assistance, but it could also be fully automated. So you think about folks, for example, who would prefer to pay by cash as opposed to with a credit card, having a network of retail partners for accepting payment that's plugged in on the back end to a RUC system could provide more flexibility for those customers who, for whatever reason, whether it's anonymity or convenience, would prefer to pay with cash as opposed to the virtual approaches that rely on credit and debit cards. We believe this also addresses potentially some of the equity concerns around, again, payment options, not only cash, but also periodic payments. And also because we know for a lot of the members of low-income communities that already access a lot of in-person services through retail partnerships. So this could be an additional service that's offered there. On the cost effectiveness dimension, we believe that offering additional payment methods encourages more compliance. So we want to be able to look at through a potential pilot, is that actually true? Does the convenience of additional reporting methods increase compliance? And increasing compliance means reducing enforcement, which of course saves cost. So with that, I'm going to turn it for the next three examples to Roshini, and the first one up is Automaker Telematics. Roshini.
Thanks, Travis. So for the Automaker Telematics, we're talking about a small segment of users, obviously, because these are the ones that would have the relationship with a certain type of automaker supporting RUC services. And in this case, we've had a few conversations with automakers, and some of them have expressed interest in owning the whole relationship with their end user. They mentioned that they already or plan to offer subscription services to their telematics packages, and sometimes they go so far as to offer financing services. So what if they could be CAMs, commercial account managers? That is something that they themselves mentioned that they'd be willing to test. And as they are building their new generation connected vehicles, they are also exploring whether they can bake in some standards into their vehicle softwares, like standards for tolling. And they're also trying to figure out whether what standards they should build in for RUC. So we wanted to see how we could leverage that interest and the capabilities that they are building to see whether there could be an automaker supported RUC, and whether they could do that in a more cost-efficient way if they own the data source, because they have the vehicles, they own the relationship with the clients. So that would be basically asking them whether it is feasible for them to support the core RUC functions that I introduced a little bit earlier, and offer a great user experience to their end users, who after all have come to them to buy a vehicle and potentially prefer having the relationship with their automaker than with any other entity. So in this case, what we want to do is, as we look at the different dimension, is try to figure out from an equity perspective, acknowledging that we are talking about a small segment that specifically relates to the automaker, whether they can provide RUC services and connectivity everywhere, including in rural areas, so that this is not just a service that would benefit people in certain areas. Cost of collection, well, we're giving them, as we're talking with them, we're trying to give them a challenge. What is the lowest cost of collection that you can demonstrate? And that would allow us to, that could demonstrate as you collect rock based on your vehicle processes. And then in terms of user experience, we're kind of giving them an incentive. Can automakers, we're asking them whether they can address the core concerns of users. The core concerns of their end users, especially the ones relating to privacy. So what if they can collect the data and process the data and map the data to charging zones or rock zones so that they don't have to divulge where the mileage was driven and just send the aggregated data to state administrations, for example, without waive some concerns and contribute to a more positive rock experience for the end user. And if they offer in their service package the ability to pay for rock, report rock and pay for rock, could they assess a service provider fee for that and consider that as value-added services? So as we have those conversations with them, we are also trying to figure out whether this is an opportunity for them to test their business models and gauge users' interest in having them as a dedicated commercial account manager. We can move to the next one now. Thank you. So this one is another business model based on data aggregators. This one would be specifically focused on fleets that are covered by commercial insurance. And in this model, we'd have basically a data aggregator getting data from a variety of sources, usage-based insurance sources. That fleet companies have already opted into. And the idea here is to try to figure out whether that segment, the fleet segment, could report RUC in what we call a passive way, meaning they are already doing that for insurance. What if we leverage that data and use it for RUC so that they don't have to duplicate their reporting efforts? And by doing that, one of the things we hope to test or explore is, are we able to leverage the data already collected by a data aggregator to lower the cost of data collection, at least for vehicle fleets, by leveraging those existing mechanisms? And in terms of user experience for fleets, the fact that we could potentially be reducing the amount of reporting work and leveraging the existing customer relationships maybe would make that painless enough to make the user experience neutral, even positive, if everything were provided to them on a single invoice, for example. So that's for the data aggregators. We can move to the last one. This last concept is a little bit more general, meaning it doesn't just address one type of user. It would be a bit more expansive. This is basically leveraging the mobility as a service platform providers' capabilities. And here I just want to explain what we mean by mobility as a service or MaaS providers. They are providers that have what we'd call a mobility platform that provide access to an integrated network of different transportation modes. Through its single digital interface, which you can see on the screen here, it's an iPhone or it's a smartphone, it's an Android phone, it's basically an app on a phone that connects a user to a network of transportation modes. So as we discussed with MaaS providers, what we saw is that they may have the building blocks in place to support the core RUC functions. And they have that user relationship already. So if they can leverage that user relationship and support and also leverage their relationships they have with a variety of technology providers, Maybe this can help inform the equity dimension that we are researching. Because they'll be able to support a variety of choice for a variety of users, eventually help with decision making because they have well-designed apps that usually help guide people, orient people towards the choices that are in their best interests. They usually have flexible payment plans and generally low transaction fees. Also, they tend to design their apps in a way that encourages compliance by giving incentives, meaning that ultimately this could help, again, reduce the investments needed in enforcement, just because there are nudges towards compliance. And then in terms of cost of collection, same thing. I mean, I just mentioned that built-in incentives could increase compliance. And user experience in general, because they already have a relationship with the end user and they offer an integrated platform, users usually have a single interface where they can see all the charges that are related to their transportation costs. So that can make it easier for users to process to track their expenses and to know that everything is in one place. Last thing, gamification, that is something we found to be a strength of mass providers. By gamifying, again, they help increase compliance and, of course, eventually reduce cost of collection by avoiding excessive investments in enforcement. Yeah, I think you have it all now.
Thanks, Roshini. Next slide, and this is where we will pause for questions and hopefully some discussion. These are the same 4 questions we had at the beginning. They all add up to fundamentally what we're asking is, what would be most useful and relevant and interesting from your point of view to test? We, as your project team of consultants, of course, would love to do all of it, but we have to prioritize resources and also prioritize what the issues are that we want to resolve, and focusing in again on the key issues that we've been directed to look at: equity, cost of collection, user experience, and of course, always looking out for privacy. So you've heard about manual collection, retail partnerships, automaker telematics, fleet-based data aggregation, and then mobility as a service platforms as 5 examples. And so while we open up for discussion, looking for hands raising on early ideas, thoughts, feedback. Maybe an additional question to think as a thought exercise is, hopefully all of you will be test subjects. So imagining yourself as a participant in some of this research next year, which of these ideas would you be most interested in testing out and having the experience and shaping the experience and helping us to build more equitable and more cost-effective ways of delivering a RUC system? So that's where we will leave our presentation for today, and look forward hopefully to some feedback and questions and discussion about where we're heading with these pilot concepts. And if you don't have any initial thoughts, if you like them all equally, that's fine too. We'll see if we can do them all. And we will have another opportunity through the spotlight sessions in the fall to take it a step further. So just to look ahead, the idea is that we will have a final selection of sub-pilot concepts that we will present to you at the December steering committee meeting for discussion and adoption. And then we will move ahead in 2022 with actually putting those pilot concepts together. And in case there's any doubt, our team has pretty high confidence, at least in the 5 that we've presented to you today, that we can in fact deliver them with the business partners that we've been having conversations with in industry. And between our existing team members, we have pretty high confidence that we can at least put together pilot concepts that would be very interesting test beds for all of you, as well as for some members of the public and other stakeholders who might care to take part and provide us with some experience-based feedback.
This is Hester. I have a quick question.
Please go ahead, Hester.
Thank you. I apologize. I had to step away for a second. I'm looking at the MAS platform one. Is the idea that we would design something, or we would, because I just know there's so much other work being done to develop MAS platforms, and would it be kind of like a partnership with other folks who are already doing it? I just don't want us to recreate the wheel. Okay.
Absolutely. No, we don't either. We don't have the budget for that anyway. So we would definitely be looking at a partnership with an existing MAS platform provider who might be able to build a RUC component on top of it. And Rashini, I don't know if you have anything else you'd want to add.
No, essentially it's that. It's like we're going to test whether we can use their existing capabilities. That's the whole philosophy, and not develop anything from scratch. Because I mean, one of the challenge statements we're giving them is show us that you can do it at the lowest rate possible. So as if you imagine that grid with the 9 cells, so we're asking them, hey, if we have to choose you for 2 or 3 things, what would it be that your business is fully optimized to do?
Thank you so much.
And we'll avoid doing anything from scratch.
Sharon.
Just to fill the silence, I would say, that all the pilots are on the right track. Transparency, simplicity, cost reduction are all tremendous values that the better we can optimize, the better for rolling out. And I also am just very curious about, and working with the auto manufacturers, just the public-private sector interaction on this seems to me to be a bottleneck where things really could go awry. So next time when you do the spotlights, I just like to hear who some of the private sector people are that we are actually working with that are advising you, because I think that will go a long way to convincing legislators that we've done the homework.
Right. That's a great comment. Okay. Not seeing any other hands raised, we will continue to push forward on all of these fronts and more. And if we can do it all, we will. And if we can't do it all, we will suggest some prioritization and come back to you through the fall spotlights and again at the December meeting to make those final selections. So Annalise, if you could take us to the last section, which is next steps. And here is basically what I just said verbally and on a slide for you to read. And at this point, I will hand it over to Roy to reiterate some of the points here and close us out for today. And I want to thank all of you and all of my colleagues from Burke Consulting and Yates and EnviroIssues for all their work supporting this effort. Roy, are you still with us? You're muted if so.
Yes, I am.
There we are. Okay.
Trying to
bring
hit
us
the
home,
button.
Roy.
So before we finish, I want to thank all the presenters. I also want to thank everybody for not only attending today's meeting, but also for participating. I know for me, this was a very good, thought-provoking meeting. And again, this meeting will be posted on our webpage after the meeting. I need to remind everybody, it should be on your screen, that we are having 3 spotlight sessions this coming fall, October and November. We heard from some of you about the spotlight sections needing to be spread out. So we're having 3 meetings over 2 months. Hopefully this will make it easier for everybody to attend. Our next RUC steering committee will be held on December 13th. This is our first in-person meeting in approximately 2 years. The meeting will be on December 13th, and it will be held at the SeaTac Airport. At this meeting, as Travis said, we will be reviewing the final decisions regarding the pilot test concept for the next phase of the research. And with all that being said, is there anything else that we need to accomplish before we adjourn this meeting? Seeing none, at 11:50, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks all.